Good evening. I'm Dermot Bolger, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Irish Cultural Centre's Digital Literary Festival. The centre is based in Hammersmith, London. For the past 25 years, it has delivered to its patrons the most diverse Irish cultural and educational programme outside Ireland. The festival consists of a series of interviews featuring some of the most successful authors in contemporary Irish writing. They will be discussing, and some of them will also be reading from their recent publications. My interview this evening is with the author, Carlo Gébler. Carlo, it is a pleasure to talk to you always. I wish we were talking in the Irish Cultural Centre in Hammersmith, sipping cappuccinos and men of the world, but we are in darkest Drumcondra and darkest Fermanagh. I speak to you from, of course, one of your ancestral homelands, because your father grew up across the road, across the park from me, and discovered literature in the park that I'm now looking at out my window through a dog-eared copy of Charles Dickens. Am I correct?
Yes, Great Expectations. My father was a apprentice cinema projectionist in Wolverhampton. And his family left Wolverhampton and moved back to Dublin, leaving him behind. He was very unhappy, and he followed them in 1929, 30, the dates are a bit vague, and they were all living in 43 Botanic Avenue.
Yeah, which is, anybody watching is that way.
Yes. And they had a water closet. And in the water closet, there was a book that you were meant to use for the purposes that one uses paper in a water closet. It was Dickens. And he started reading Dickens and then removed it from the water closet. That's his story, at any rate.
And here we are many, many years later, you know? And I want to talk to you about the new version of Decameron that you have done. But just go back to, I grew up in a world that didn't really have books. It didn't really have literature. You know, there was a mobile library, came twice a week to think something else. But you grew up, unusual for a writer, in a world where you learned very early on that people could sit in a room and type and send things off the post, and that money would come back in, and that writing was a commercial activity that one could actually possibly engage in. Did this make writing seem very unusual or very normal when you were growing up?
I think the latter. I think normal. So my parents were writers. So my father was a man called Ernest Gébler, who made a lot of money from principally a book about the Voyage of the Mayflower, which is the ship that took the pilgrims from England and Ireland to America to establish the first white Protestant settlement, and was made into a film with Spencer Tracy. The film and the book were called The Voyage of the Mayflower. He married a woman, it was his second marriage, called Edna O'Brien, she wanted to be a writer when they married, and she later became a writer, and I think it would be quite fair to say, a better known writer than Ernest Gébler. When I was a child, we lived in modest circumstances. Well, actually not so modest. We first of all lived out in Roundwood at Loch Dan, then we lived in Garville Avenue, and then we moved to a mock Tudor semi in Morden at the end of the Northern Line in London. There were books in the house. You went to sleep with the sound of your father typing, because my father was nocturnal. He typed all night and slept in the day. And then you came home, went to school, came home from school, and there was my mother typing on the window seat in our bedroom or in a little hut at the end. Manuscripts gathered up into the brown envelope, off, check in post sometime later. This was a lesson once learnt, never forgotten. But what I got from my parents and from other people that I knew was that writers really can't afford to suffer from writer's block. Plumbers don't suffer from plumber's block. Bricklayers don't suffer from bricklayer's block. It's a job. You create the words, generate the text, make the money.
Well, you need to perpetually reinvent yourself. I'm just looking here at the Dead Eight, which is this wonderful recreation of a famous murder, a famous miscarriage of justice in the 1940s in rural Tipperary. At the Projectionist, which is your biography of your own father, at your memoir of your father. At this wonderful, small and harrowing book, The Wing Orderly's Tales, which is about life in prison.
Yes.
A sequence of short stories which basically say, do not go to jail.
Don't.
And if you do go to jail, do not expect the best of anybody, expect the worst of everybody.
Yes.
Then you have A Good Day of a Dog. And you also have your most recent novel was actually set in London in the 1960s and seems to have traces of autobiography. So there are bits of your own life filter into the works, in the memoirs, in some of the novels, and then bits of totally different lives. And do you feel as a writer, and we'll come to the Decameron in a moment, which is full of 100 stories, but do you feel as a writer that you perpetually, it's important not to tell the same story over and over, that you need to, in a way that say, someone we both knew, Francis Stewart, wrote 26 novels that were really the same novel, of different degrees of quality, but that to actually perpetually invent yourself in a way that say, Brian Moore was a great proponent of doing?
I would like to think that I do different things at different times, that reinvention takes place, but I'm certain that underneath everything, there is a theme or a fixation, and it's probably a fixation with unfairness and inequality. Probably at the root of it, there's a sense that the way the world is organized is capricious and unjust and merciless.
And is that one of the things that attracted you? I'm going to drop all your books on the ground.
That's all right.
And you can hear from the sound just how large and over you have created. Is this sense of injustice one of the things that attracted you to Decameron? Because you grew up in a world of writers, you would have understood early on Samuel Johnson's thing that only a blockhead writes anything except money. And Sammy Cahn, the American songwriter, was once asked what came first, the music or the lyrics, and he said the phone call. And so did this new book, Tales We Tell Ourselves, which are just 28 tales from the famous Decameron, did that come about from a phone call? Did it come about from, how did the idea of making this new adaptation of this classic work from the plague in the 14th century come about?
It came about, I had heard of the Decameron, and when the lockdown started, I did find myself thinking in idle moments, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I must have a little peek at that. But the catalyst was not my producing a treatment. It was the publisher, Edwin Hegel. I think he might have emailed first or possibly telephoned, and with great precision and attack, asked me if I was aware of this text, thought this text had any potential, etc., etc. And I was still working in the prison before COVID had closed the prison at that point. And I did my 5 hours teaching drama on the prison, and I went back to a flat in Belfast, opened one of the Decameron tales, and read it, and then dictated a new version on the spot. I'm not saying it was very good, but I just spoke it, 1,500 words, and sent it off to Edwin as an example of what you could do with the content.
And just to explain what the Decameron is, it is a tale of 100, it's like one story and there's 100 stories. It's a story of 7 women and 3 men who remove themselves from the threat of the Black Death by going to a remote villa near Florence, and by basically keeping their spirits up, keeping their hopes up by telling stories each night, so that there are 100 tales involved, and the stories get progressively darker as you go deeper into the human condition. There's a plot there's a theme for each night, and that it's also written in the Florentine dialect. So like the author's like the Roddy Doyle of his day in the sense of writing and coming out of not from the noble class but from the merchant class, and sort of possibly many of the themes that are a sense of injustice, a sense of mockery of the church, that sense of sort of how people are not necessarily two-faced, but people will do good things, but they'll do bad things, and those bad things are advantageous. All seem to maybe come out of that background.
He is always emotionally true. Mm-hmm. He doesn't sugar the pill, so to speak, about human behavior. Mm-hmm. But he's writing this book sort of between 1348, which is when the plague really started. We don't really know when he started, but 1348 to 42 is roughly when he produced this doorstopper, 700 pages, and he wrote it by pen, quill, and ink. He then rewrote it and revised it several years later. Mm. So he had all these stories that existed in the air that people told one another. Stories about people in Florence, stories about gods and goddesses, all this content. And he repurposed it and gave it to his 10 characters, and they tell it to each other. And one of the things that interested me about, or one of the many things that interest me about the Decameron is, when you read it, you can see, this is the moment, or one of the moments, when literature goes from being mythic and archaic to being realistic. Mm. You go, oh, right, so Maupassant and Chekhov, or Roddy Doyle, or James Joyce, or all of these people who we now take as standard exemplars of literary narrative, what they do, the technique, is first tried by Boccaccio in the Decameron. I mean, one of the things that he's really good at, which is a really difficult thing to do, is the dual plot, things running in parallel. In this room, the man is drinking the wine. In that room, she's leaning out the window. Oh, look, there's a man coming along the street. Now, and he pulls all these things together. And few writers before that had done that as well. He creates these little Swiss watch mechanisms that sort of keep time. And you can see the way literature is moving from gods and goddesses and destiny and fate and caprice to, once upon a time, there's a man, his character is like this, he marries a woman who's like that, as a result, this thing happens. Realism.
I always thought that Ulysses is an incredibly democratic book. It's democratic in the sense that it deals with every emotion that is there, and it deals with every person in it. And it's just like a very, it's just, firstly, could you describe this as the first novel, even though the novel form isn't invented, but the first prototype of an actual printed novel? And is it a very democratic book in that sense of dealing with sort of all aspects of the human condition?
It, I would say, absolutely is. And it has things in it. I've only taken 28 of 100 stories. Mm-hmm. It has very little of the repulsive stuff. Mm-hmm. There's almost no anti-Semitism, for instance, which is pretty remarkable. But you have, so I've taken 28 of the 100 stories. One of them is like a prototype Joe Orton story. It's about a gay man married to a heterosexual woman, and they essentially agree to share a lover together in the bed together. This is 1348. You don't think of 1348 as being a time when people would tell those sorts of stories. It also has a very, very famous kind of classic story about an attempt by Saladin to entrap a Jewish banker and extort money out of him. But the Jewish banker outmaneuvers Saladin. And it's essentially a story that is a plea for religious tolerance. And it says, no, you can't say one religion is better than another religion, because that leads to conflict. You have stories about jealousy, which is one of the great motors of human behavior, and the things that people will do because they're jealous. And it's also got stories about people behaving really badly towards each other, doing really horrible things.
And also, it doesn't have that sort of, possibly maybe what's interesting is that most art of that time is painting, and is commissioned by the church or is commissioned by rich patrons, which this presumably is not commissioned by anybody.
No.
And therefore it doesn't have to have a neat wrap up of morality. It doesn't actually have I can't remember the name of the set of rules for American films where the husband had to keep one foot on the
the Hays Code.
And the actual and the gangster always had to get shot. Sometimes, like, the gangster or the pirate doesn't get shot. He actually does bad things, does good things, and goes home rich.
The stories about clerical abuse and sexual malpractice contain absolutely no. You feel that Boccaccio doesn't approve personally of this behavior. He's not interested in getting onto a soapbox and lambasting the church, and he tells the truth. The clerics do terrible things and they prosper. Nothing happens. The only thing that matters is not to get caught. That's all.
And so, what was the reaction to the book when it came out? I noticed that reading about the book that it was actually very popular among the mercantile class themselves, among merchants. Would pass it, and I remember, again, to mention him for the second and last time, our friend Francis Stewart. And Francis, in very early on, published a magazine called Tomorrow, which is famous for having one of Yeats's most famous poems. I think Yeats did most of the writing, and Francis fronted the magazine. And he always spoke very proudly of how it used to regularly get passed around the smoking room in the Irish Midlands, in those commercial hotels where traveling salesmen sort of going first, and they found it quite a shocking sort of read. And so, did it have that sort of life of being passed from merchant to merchant, and that sense of that here was a way to actually mock the nobility, to mock the religious, right? That here was a new middle class coming through, and that they could actually sort of, and that this spoke to them.
Some people disapproved of it. Savonarola probably burnt it with the books when he burnt the other, in inverted commas, bad books. The church never repudiated it. It looked askance. More importantly, Boccaccio never repudiated it. He did become religious. He eventually took holy orders. And he was friendly with people like Petrarch, who disapproved of it. But he kept it in circulation. He rewrote it. He improved it. Amongst the reading public, of course, the reading public in medieval times is not the same as the reading public now. And especially amongst women, who were its principal intended audience, it was hugely popular. And it has always been in print ever since.
It's also very sympathetic towards women. Those are the women, a sense of are trapped in the home, they're trapped, they're often lovesick, they're often cheated upon, whereas men have great freedom there. So it's quite a feminist text in as much as one can have one in the 14th century.
He is absolutely honest about the facts, the way that society is organized. He's not a person who's interested in telling you how he wishes life were. He is a writer who is only interested in telling you or bearing witness to how life actually is. You're not necessarily going to like it, but this is it. And he also knows that if he's going to carry you along, if he doesn't present you with materials that you recognize, you're not going to buy into it. If a writer wants to bring somebody on the journey, that somebody who is brought on the journey has to be going, yeah, go along. Yeah, actually, you're funny. Yeah, absolutely. And he's extremely good at doing that.
But to move from him to you, and to reinventing a book 667 years after it was first written, I mean, what was your motivation? You say in the introduction that the book has a revolutionary premise, which is that suffering in a pandemic can rid us of humanity, but that fiction is a way that we can get it back. And do you feel that in this time of lockdown, in this time when suddenly, when it's very hard to actually physically get to a bookshop, but we are reading books like never before, that fiction that can unlock something within us that actually and help us to cope with these times we live in?
Yes, I do. I mean, I had two separate impulses. One is the 19th century socialist William Morris always or frequently used to talk about, he used to say, well, if you make a chair or you make a knife and fork, you're doing something that somebody has been doing. You're actually replicating something that's already been done. And probably you're doing it worse. And what he wanted to do was to rebuke mass production and get people to go back to making things that were beautiful and that cared about. But he's absolutely correct about the idea that so much of what we do builds on what has gone before and we replicate it. So one of my impulses is my belief that the same applies to literature. We think of ourselves and we think of literature as something that just sort of is of now and it happens. But actually, it is not something that just happened. Once upon a time, a man sat in a room in Florence by candlelight and scratched stuff out. And when you read his stuff, you go, oh my gosh, that's where that comes from. That's where that comes from. So many of the tropes in our culture, the braggart, the cunning soldier, many types which exist in the popular culture today in television and cinema and so forth, are there in their first form in Boccaccio. So I'm interested in getting people to honor what has gone before, because it's the humus out of which you spring. That's one idea. The second idea that impelled me to write the book is, here are these stories that were written to get people back in touch with their humanity, which they had lost, which they'd been sundered from because the Black Death was catastrophic. 2/3 of the population died in Florence and in Italy. It was a considerably worse catastrophe than COVID-19. I mean, COVID-19 is terrible, but it is not it is not as epic as what happened with the Black Death. But I want people to look at these stories and think, this is how the personality was re-knitted, reintegrated. And that's something that it is always worth thinking about. These stories still do something for people in the 21st century. They might continue to be able to affect this magic or this psychic repair work. And if they can't do that, I think they can, but if they can't do that, they can at least incline people to think about how narrative can help us to recover, because nothing else is going to do it.
And when you say that you read this book and you say, oh, that's where that comes from, that's where that comes from, all this sort of this bedrock of stories that people have built on over the last 650 years. At the same time, this is an age before copyright, which is a very modern concept, and in folk songs being rewritten. And so none of these tales are actually his. These tales are tales that he's reinvented. These tales are, and a phrase that's become very ubiquitous today is cultural appropriation, which didn't really exist in Florence in the actual 14th century, because these are tales from the Middle East, these are tales from Spain, these are tales from around the world. He is creating this compendium of basically all the stories. And do you feel, comedians often say that there's only X number of jokes. Do you feel that as a writer, there's only X number of stories and that they're all in the Decameron and that they all come from before the Decameron?
Yes, I do. I feel that the human condition, which Boccaccio testifies to and analyzes, is we are people, we are restless souls who are usually unable to accept what we have and invariably want more. And wanting more, I'm sounding like a Buddhist, wanting more.
Yeah, Buddhists don't have those headphones, I generally find.
And wanting more, we get ourselves into trouble. Because when you get to the end of the Decameron, what Boccaccio seems to be saying is relinquish, just do with less. You don't need to be famous. You don't need to be successful. You don't need, just try and live in the moment.
And do you think it's structured in that way that actually that it brings us over these 10 nights of storytelling, it brings us on a journey into the human condition?
Yes. And I think I personally think the way the stories start light and progressively get darker and darker, the middle section, which are stories about people who are, very unhappy, thwarted in love, like The Pot of Basil is a very famous story. It's in the collection.
Yeah.
This is the young girl who falls in love with a man, and then her brothers cut his head off. No, kill him. And she finds the corpse, cuts the head off, puts it into a pot of basil, and weeps onto the pot, and the basil flourishes. And then the brothers take the pot away and throw the head into the sea or bury it on a beach and destroy her, make her go mad. That's a really terrible story. Keats used it for Isabella, his great narrative poem. That's in the middle. And then when you get to the end, there are these, in the last section, there are these strange stories about people. There are these strange stories of hope. So I think that the whole thing is organized in order to affect the psyche, affect the repair of the psyche, and reinforce human capacity and a belief in hope. Yes.
Almost every time you go to the theatre and there's a revival of a play by Shakespeare or a new version of a Greek tragedy, they're updated and they try to have them in like 1920s costumes, or have them present day costumes, or have them set some. Was there any temptation for you to say, I want to update the location of these stories, or would they simply fall apart if you tried to make them too contemporary?
No, I think I was very clear that I didn't want to do that. I wanted to leave people in their doublet and hose and the ladies in their wimples and their long gowns. One reason for not modernizing it is that Boccaccio's world is a religious world. And that's something that God's dead now. I don't know when he died, but he died recently. We've stopped God. But our ancestors really did believe. And both Boccaccio and Petrarch, his friend, Petrarch more than Boccaccio, did understand the bubonic plague as being related to moral behavior. Something had been done by humanity, and this was the punishment that you got. So Boccaccio was able to believe in that stuff, but at the same time, he's free enough to write stories about people who don't believe. There's an incredible story, which is in the collection, about two men. They agree. Whoever dies first comes back. And the one who comes back tells the one who's living that his idea of sin, sleeping, having a relationship with his godson's mother, irrelevant. They don't care about that. There's it's nothing. Small potatoes. In hell or purgatory, forget it. No one's interested in that. And that's in 1352. That's extraordinary.
And yet the religious context is interesting in the sense of the religious framework, because I remember a story that Tony Cronin, the late Tony Cronin, told me of going to China for the first time to give a lecture in the university. And the professor said to him, we hope you will explain to us this thing you have in European literature, this thing that's central to European literature that we can't understand. And Tony was wondering what they meant, and he kept trying to figure out what they were talking about. And they said, I'm not quite sure which central facet you mean. And they said, this thing called original sin. What the hell is original sin?
Yeah.
And then I only realized that, how much of European literature was based around this whole notion, was framed in a religious context, or saw the world, as you say, framed the world through a religious preconception, which I think a lot of these stories wouldn't actually work if they were
No.
But how hard was it to narrow it down to 28, beyond the fact that you're walking against the clock, which is what most writers are doing?
That's a very good question. I went through the text. The book is Decameron means 10 days. So there's 10 days of storytelling, and within each day, there's 10 stories. And I went through and picked, say, the 3 best stories out of each day. And Edwin Hegel, the publisher with whom I was working on this, did the same thing. We compared notes. Sometimes we picked the same stories, sometimes we hadn't. Usually we had. And originally my idea, first of all, I thought I'd do 40. That was too much. Then I thought I'd do 20. And in the end, I you have to have a system, okay? So I decided on 28 stories because 2 and 8 make 10.
Yes.
That's it. That's why it's 28. And some days I took more stories, some days I had less stories. So the 10th day, the most optimistic day, so to speak, when Boccaccio is being his most uplifting, there's only 1.
Yeah, yeah.
But the Unhappy Lovers, which is day 4, that's got the Pot of Basil. That's day 4 I've got the most stories from day 4, apart from the first day, because these Unhappy Lovers stories are so powerful.
And how do you think people will react to the book? Do you think that people will draw parallels with the COVID-19 pandemic and with that sense of entrapment that of suddenly from leading such free lives that we led in terms of traveling around the world, and if suddenly we were locked into we weren't quite locked into a villa outside Florence. We weren't that lucky, but we were in Ireland. We were trapped in a 2-kilometre zone from our houses at one stage for around 5 weeks, and each of us in different places had different forms of lockdown and different forms of rules suddenly thrust upon us.
What's interesting about the Decameron is there is at the beginning, the setup, the shoehorn, it describes the plague.
Yeah.
It acknowledges there's a plague and 7 women are in a church and 3 men come in and they decide to go to the country. None of the stories refer to the plague. None. And what's interesting about lockdown art, especially on television, is that it tries to use and take advantage of and exploit, and why shouldn't it, lockdown. So you have films that are made entirely through Zoom meetings, for instance, and that's absolutely fine. But Boccaccio's idea seemed to be that you needed to expose yourself and immerse yourself and saturate yourself in content outside your incarceration experience, that's going to be most beneficial to you. So that's one thing that I think may be a reason why people might be interested in this. In answer to your question, will people be allured by this book? Secondly, it's one of those cornerstones of literature, you know, like the Bible and the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Decameron. But it's a whopper, and it's truculent and it's difficult. So this is a way of entering that material briefly, quickly. And I would like to say, you can read these 28 stories and you'll have a really good idea of Boccaccio's tone and quality and virtue and specificity. But you'll have done it in 2 hours instead of 20 hours. No harm in that. None of us have time. I also hope that people will look at it and think, oh, wow. So this man who Shakespeare dredged and appropriated content from big time, Chaucer dredged and appropriated content from big time, Dryden, all of these figures, if you go through English literature, they all stole from Boccaccio. People will go, so this is what they stole from. Yeah, they stole wisely. I mean, when you're going to plagiarize or steal or appropriate, you know, take the good stuff. Probably the foundations of literature in English, as we know it, are Ovid and Boccaccio.
And do you feel the need to go back to these reservoirs of the very beginning of literature, in addition to, say, writing about prison, writing about your own life, and because the book you're writing now, the book you have in progress, and your publisher will kill me for mentioning a book that actually isn't actually in print as yet, goes back to Greek mythology.
Yes, that's the novel, which will be published after the Boccaccio book, is called The Late King of Thebes, and it's Antigone's biography of Oedipus. Why have I gone back to this content? Why am I interested in this material? It's incredibly, I think the simplest answer I can give you is, it's easier, this is very pretentious, pretentiousness alert, ladies and gentlemen, it's easier to write a sonnet than to write free verse. You have something, it's discrete, you found it, you can repurpose it, you know its boundaries, you know its shape, and you can put it back in front of people in a new and revivified or reanimated form whilst maintaining its original integrity, and it will be something of heft and allure. People will want to.
Yourself as well. I mean, because writers put themselves into all the books. So, I mean, in these books, is there something of your? Is Carlo Gébler like Alfred Hitchcock in one scene of his movies? In one scene of every movie, is how much of Carlo Gébler is sort of filtering through these books?
Yes, if we go at it in reverse order, The Late King of Thebes is about the really curious fact that we are completely our freedom is completely curtailed. We don't do anything that hasn't already been predestined. And at the same time, everything that we do, we choose to do. That's a very curious state in which to find oneself, but that seems to me to be what it is like to live in the 21st century. So Oedipus was predestined to kill his father Laius on the road outside the Delphic. Oh, he was predestined to kill his father. But what happens is he leaves the Delphic oracle, having been told he's going to kill his father, who he thinks is someone else. He's in a terrible state. He's on the road. He meets this blowhard who's going to the Delphic oracle, who says, "Oi, get out of the way." He goes, "No, I won't get out of the way." They start to fight. He chooses to kill Laius. But it's also predestined. And that seems, you know, in these strange political times in which we live, that seems to be the way it is. You know, we are living, populism is on the rise. These people are awful, they're manipulative, they're dark, they're controlling. But at the same time, we're choosing to have them rule our lives. We're picking them. We want them. It's this duality. You are not free, and you are also free. You do what you do. So that's what interests me about Oedipus. All my knowledge of Oedipus primarily comes from Sophocles' trilogy of plays about Oedipus. I'm interested in Boccaccio because I am interested in, I'm interested in telling stories, but I'm also interested in how people tell stories. And I'm interested in putting something into the public domain that shows somebody very early, but extraordinarily proficiently doing what we now take for granted. We read, we absorb vast amounts of fiction, mostly from TV, but TV comes from literature, and literature has its roots in Boccaccio. So I'm interested in showing people how extraordinarily talented these old people were, who only had a pen, a quill, and a bit of ink and some paper. They didn't have computers or any of the advantages we have. They held all this content in their head and they just produced it. And they were, you know, Boccaccio is like you and I. He's a creature of Grub Street.
And he has to make a living, and he has to survive. And obviously, you're shaped by your personal circumstance, you're shaped by the literature you read and how that fiddles into your bedrock, and how much of your character and much of your writing has been shaped in the last 20 years by working in prisons. Because that when you go into that world, you can't just presumably just leave it behind when you walk out. You must carry an awful lot of the weight of that world back outside, and it must filter into your imagination, your dreams, and your writing.
Prison is the most important thing that's ever happened to me, in terms of being shaped, in terms of being as a psyche recalibrated. Prison was my university. First of all, I met a lot of people who don't talk the way I talk, and whose socioeconomic group is not my socioeconomic group. People often wonder whether prison is full of antagonism. Nothing could be further from the truth. For teachers, there is no antagonism at all. There is antagonism between prisoners for each other, don't get me wrong. And also between, prisoners and prison officers can be antagonistic to one another. But for someone like me, no antagonism at all. Prison is also connected to Boccaccio in this sense. In a prison, you have television, but you have none of the things that we're used to. Obviously, you don't have mobile phones. Well, I mean, people do have them in their cells, but they're forbidden. And narrative, the ability to construct a story. Wait till you hear this. Okay, once upon a time, that capacity is highly regarded and esteemed. Literacy, because nothing happens in a prison unless it's written down, is also highly regarded. And prison for people who are not literate is particularly difficult because unless it's written down, it doesn't happen. And prison really reminded me of how these ancient traditions, one person telling another person a story and holding their interest, making the story interesting, finding the right words to bring it to life, dramatizing the dialogue, acting out the people, doing the voices, all of that kind of stuff. These really basic storytelling techniques, which have been atrophied and undermined by modern culture because we don't value it, are priceless. And they are part of being, they are right at the core of being a human being. And they're what we need to hold on to and develop. And prison forces people to get in touch with that capacity, which often, whilst they're out and about, this is people who go to prison, they've lost touch with. This is a sideline, but it's interesting. I know a lot of people who go to prison and write something they'd never do outside and read. Then they leave prison, everything is put in the bin bag, no more writing, no more reading, and they're back to the life that they were leading before they went to prison. Not always. Not always. Some people, they get the literature, they get the education bug, and they keep going. The other thing about prison is, how do I put this? The way basically we're told that the way the world is organized is fair and, the system has our interests at heart and, well, you go into a prison and you talk to people and you find out that that's simply not true. Not true at all.
So there's a link into the Decameron, that the Decameron is very much about the real politic of survival.
Yeah, absolutely. You find out what has happened to people to cause them to offend. Technically, they went into a petrol station, drew a knife out, held it to the man behind the till and made him open it. And, it was terrifying. But once you start talking to the person who did that, you find that that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's this huge, great hidden bulk under the water, their entire life story, which will be a terrible childhood. I mean, people listening to this may think, oh, he's a bleeding heart liberal, but actually social conditions, housing, education, the relationship with your parents, marital and parental dysfunction, all of these things and many other factors are all part of what the sociologists call offending behavior. We only get the little tip of the iceberg, the thing that the person has done. It's not explained to us. But when you talk to prisoners, they tell you.
Somebody asked me to read their novel recently, but didn't call it a novel. They said that it was an expansion of their MPhil dissertation,
Right.
which was they worked on it. And the world of the Decameron is a very different world. The world of, say, your book set in the 60s is a different world. And I sometimes also feel that the world that we became writers in is a different world. And I'd love you to tell the story of how, because I might have it wrong, of how your first novel was accepted, almost without you even knowing it. And
I can, yeah.
And actually then to talk about how is it easier or more difficult to be, if you're a young writer setting out today, is that an easier part or a harder part than when you were starting out?
I'll explain how I got published, and then I'll answer your question, because I think it'd be clearest if I do it in that order. I was a student at the National Film, what was called the National Film School, later became the National Film and Television School. And I had to write things and write scripts. And I also, whilst I was at the National Film School, I went to the Polish Film School for 3 months. And I had a very important lesson taught to me, which is a film isn't finished until it's shot. And I met a lot of people in Poland who, for political reasons, wrote marvelous scripts that never got greenlit. And that was very frustrating. I thought to myself after that experience, I like working in film and television, but you know, you've got to finish. You've got to have something that's done and it's got a cover and it's in the bookshop or it's on the library shelf. Even if it doesn't make any money, it's done. It's complete. You must complete. So I leave the film school. I work in the cutting rooms. I'm starting to write stories and things. And I wrote something and gave it to a friend of mine to read. And he got a man in to put up some bookshelves. And the man called John Milne, said, I brought a sandwich. Have you got anything I can read at lunchtime? And my friend Pierre said, oh, here's something. It's my friend Carlo. He's written this. And John was a writer and a carpenter. So John, eating his egg sandwich, starts reading this. And he thinks, oh, he rings me up. He says, yeah, I read your manuscript when I was having my lunch. I'm going to get my editor to dinner. I'm going to get you to dinner. He lived in Bethnal Green, and I'll introduce you. And he just said, oh, Julian, this is Carlo. He's written something. You might want to, I think you should publish him. That was it. That was literally it. And then in the street in Bethnal Green afterwards, it was a very hot day. Julian says, oh, I suppose, writes his number down, ring him up, send him something in the post. And eventually that leads to, that wouldn't happen now.
No.
And that's why it's impossible, much more difficult to function and enter the world of literature as a writer now than then. We're talking about 1980. I'm talking about 1980. That's 40 years ago. Yeah. And
when editors had like something like Peter Strauss and Pickett or someone just had, you could buy any book for under £25,000 on his own whim. He didn't need. Whereas now, and you know, your publisher or your editor has to go in and pitch it in a room with full of people and persuade the marketing people and this person and become an advocate for the book. And there's so many people involved in that decision making that wasn't around when it was a more, I don't mean it as necessarily a fairer world, but it was a world that was more, that were more willing to take chances, I think.
I mean, what happened with the publisher was, after the conversation in the street, I sent him something. He was quite interested. So he said, look, you've got a novel. I sort of had an idea for something. He said, I'll tell you what, I'll give you, write the first 10 pages and I'll give you £100. It was something like that.
Yeah.
And so you get a check and you type it out. You go, oh yeah, okay. Can you give me another 30 pages?
Yeah.
And you know, and so gradually the thing.
Yeah.
Now, not huge amounts of money were not the issue. but it was a working relationship, and more importantly, it was a working relationship which involved the intervention by the editor in the copy. Mm-hmm. So you would get back in the post something with writing all over it. No, yes, move, why, etc. Mm-hmm. That kind of relationship, which is so necessary, mm-hmm. doesn't really exist mm-hmm. anymore, I don't think. Mm-hmm. Not really, because publishers themselves are so overwhelmed and beleaguered.
They're so pressurized that they don't. You get one chance to send a book to a publisher, and if the book isn't right, there's no point in saying this book takes off on page 50 because they don't get to page 50.
No.
But at the same time, there are new writers coming through the whole time. And in addition to teaching in prison, you also teach in Trinity and you teach elsewhere. And is it exciting for you to still be involved and be connected to see what's coming through and actually to see the blueprint of literature in 10 years' time?
Yes. The first thing is that it's very interesting being with the young. Mm-hmm. It's very good to be with the young. Mm-hmm. Being with the young is educational, not in the sense that you would imagine, perhaps, although I am learning things, I'm teaching books, and so I'm discovering things about books from what they say. But I'm learning about what modern mass media, what platforms like Facebook and mm-hmm. so on and so forth have done to the psyche of our young generation. Mm-hmm. And I'm afraid to say I think it's pretty catastrophic. Mm-hmm. I think Facebook and all those systems have made people anxious. They endlessly compare their own lives to the lives of other people. Mm-hmm. They feel preyed upon. They feel judged. They feel inadequate. They feel all sorts of things. Smartphones and these devices are incredibly useful. We would not be able to. Modern technology is enabling this. We would 20 years ago we couldn't do this. Mm-hmm. But modern technology and social media have also done something, and I am really interested as well as terrified, stroke appalled by what I'm discovering.
Do you think it pushes people to feel they have to finish something once? Because the most successful novel I ever wrote was a novel called The Journey Home that I abandoned 11 or 12 times and wrote over the space for 5 years. My last novel, An Arcade Life, took me 13 years to write, and it was abandoned numerous times. And you write something, because you're on a massive journey, you go so far and then your imagination stops, and then you have to stop. And you have to come back to it 6 months' time, or a year's time, renewed. And so it isn't sort of a simple process. And do you think that this thing of the instant pressure of saying, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, of all these devices, of all this information being thrown out, makes them feel that they're a failure if they haven't completed something?
Absolutely. And also, what you are an organic. You, Dermot Bolger, are an organic psyche. Mm-hmm. You're made up of carbons and stuff. And out of the incredible construction that is your brain come images and words and structures, and they emerge from this organic system. They're not necessarily complete. They themselves, even though they're bits of hieroglyphic on paper or things, squiggles on a computer screen, they're organic, or they're a product of something organic. They have to be treated like something organic. Mm-hmm. So you put them in the drawer. You put your novels away, marinate for 6 months, get them out. I see it differently now. Rework it, put it away again. 5 years for one novel, 13 years for another novel. It's an organic process. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it should be. What the world that we have organized and created does is it doesn't recognize that it's that kind of a process. Mm-hmm. And publishers don't think long-term anymore. Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember talking to a man who was Boris Pasternak's English editor. Mm-hmm. He prepared Boris Pasternak's novels for publication in English. He worked at Collins. He might spend 6 months. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think he told me he did spend 6 months with Dr. Zhivago. Mm-hmm. Not full time. Mm-hmm. maybe a year. This is after, Boris has written it and it's been translated from Russian into German and into English. Mm-hmm. And all that's gone.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you a last question, Carlo. We're coming to the end of this, and I want to thank the Irish Cultural Institute in Hammersmith for allowing us to have a chat. We didn't have a coffee, but we will again.
We will.
The question, we're talking about the young, but I want to talk about the old, because I remember going to a birthday party for Anthony Cronin, mm-hmm. and it was his 90th birthday, but he wouldn't tell anybody his age. And I said to him, like, Tony, what age are you really? And he actually, at this age, he was in one of those chairs you had to move around, And he said, it's a very ageist society, Dermot. If people knew your real age, you wouldn't get the gigs. And here was a man of 90 who was still a walking writer. And even when I last visited him in James's Hospital, he was trying to write a poem, and he just didn't have the energy to lift a pen. But there was no notion ever of retiring or stopping. It was just simply, and Jack Yeats was the same, and drew a little drawing of two ponies dancing the day before he died in the nursing home in Pot of Basil in Dublin. I mean, can you ever imagine a time when Carlo Gébler is not a writer, when there isn't a book at work in your mind?
No, absolutely not. Tony Cronin is an object lesson. This is Dead as Doornails, Life of Riley, incredible poems, a humongous amount of Grub Street journalism, reviews, essays, just encyclopedic. But then at the end of his life, among other things, a brilliant, detailed, but long biography of Beckett.
Yes.
Which was written in his 80s. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. An extraordinary thing to do. But myself, can I foresee a time when I'm not writing? No. Mm-hmm. I will have to. But it might have to be shorter. Maybe I'll start poetry.
Well, maybe you should take the view of Beckett, who was once asked what he felt the day he died would be like, and he said it would be like any other day but shorter. And I think that's sort of, it would be quite nice to write having written towards the end. But the reality is that, you are a married man with 5 children. You make a living with a thin sliver of your imagination. You have done so magnificently for several decades. You've produced wonderful novels, memoirs, works of fiction, works of the imagination, reinterpretations of classic literature, and you won't make a living by talking to me. So I think we will terminate this conversation, and you should go and do some work, Carlo. Carlo, it's been a great pleasure and honor to talk to you.
I loved this conversation, Dermot. It was brilliant.
We will do it again one day.
Yes. Thank you.